Okay, so our next video is sex motivation. So I think in the first video, the intro to motivation video, I made a mistake and I said that sex is a biological need, and that was wrong. Sex is not a biological need like hunger is. If we don't eat, we die, right? So it is a basic biological need. But if we don't have sex, we don't die. So it is not a need in that sense. However, um, we do need sex in the sense that we need to pass on our genes, right? Like that is the reason for sex. The biological reason for sex is to pass on our genes. So we're going to look at sexual motivation in terms of the bio, psycho, and social aspects of it. So the biological side of it, which is the majority of our sexual motivator, right, is our sexual maturity, the sex hormones that we have in our body, especially testosterone, and then our sexual orientation. And you'll notice that we have sexual orientation in the biological side, and we're going to talk about that. But the motivators for sex are also very much so psychological and sociocultural. And that is all ever changing. Okay, so the social and the cultural aspects of sex constantly change throughout time, throughout your lifespan, in the process of a day, right? Like, so those things change. The psychological side of sex are the exposure to stimulating conditions and then sexual fantasies. And then our social cultural side of sex, right, are our family views of sex, the society views of sex, religious, personal views, and then cultural expectations. And those can be gender based, right? So the expectations for men are different for women. And so those motivators are a little bit different. So let's get into it. So the scientific study of sex started in, at least the first major study, started in the late 1940s and early 1950s with Alfred Kinsey. What he did is he just did a survey. He interviewed over 17,000 everyday people concerning their sexual behavior. And he did one aspect of this study was he looked at their sexuality. So he did it on a 0 to 6 scale, with 0 being exclusively heterosexual and 6 being exclusively homosexual. So that was kind of like the first study that was done about sex. Then Masters and Johnson brought sex into the laboratory. And once they did that, they found that their humans have a sexual response cycle, and there are 4 phases of them. You will need to know these 4 phases and the difference between men and women, and their names and the order. So you're going to need to know this. I know it's uncomfortable. Sorry, but giggle along with me. I know. So these 4 phases are the excitement phase, when the genitals become engorged with blood. So blood is rushing to the specific parts of the body that are going to be needed. This is kind of like the first kind of stage of sex when it's happening. Then there's the plateau stage. So the excitement is kind of like building up. The plateau is when the excitement peaks. Breathing and pulse and blood pressure are increasing and they are kind of at their peak. Then there's the orgasm stage. This is the release of sexual tension. The breathing and pulse and blood pressure like kind of skyrocket. And then there's contractions all over the body. And then finally, the resolution stage. This is when it's kind of after the orgasm. Think of this as kind of the refractory period, like the action potential or like a toilet bowl. Remember how the toilet bowl has to fill back up? So this is kind of that resolving the sexual release. Men, this can happen very, very quickly. Women, it happens much slower. Okay. So it kind of, people are going through this stage and they have to be fully resolved before a new excitement stage can start up. Okay, so let's talk about the psychology of sex. So much of our sexual motivation comes from the brain. Okay. What people find sexually arousing, those sexual cues, are dependent on many different stimuli, including conditioned stimuli, so things that we have associated with sexual arousal. And so those sexual cues come from the brain. We also have sexual scripts, and these are socially learned programs of sexual interpretation and responsiveness, meaning it's what we as a society deem as sexy or sexually arousing. These sexual scripts often come from the media, and they differ from different they differ among cultures, okay? So the sexual cues are what is making us aroused, and then the sexual scripts is what society is telling us should make us aroused. So let's talk about sexual orientation. Sexual orientation refers to a person's preference for emotional and sexual relationships with individuals of either the same sex, other sex, or either sex. This is separate from someone's sexual identity, okay? So sexual orientation is who you are choosing to be in a relationship with. Sexual identity is which sex you are identifying with, okay? So homosexual obviously are same sex, heterosexual, different sex, and then bisexual is either sex. So let's talk about the origins of sexual orientations. Most psychologists today view sexual orientation as kind of neither willfully chosen nor willfully changed. So we can't choose our sexual orientation and we can't change it. That's what most psychologists believe today. This has changed drastically. Just 50, 60 years ago, the homosexuality was in the DSM as a mental disorder. And the view remains controversial due to political, moral factors, social factors. So this idea that sexual orientation is not chosen is pretty controversial. But most scientific theories do point to a biological or genetic cause for sexual orientation. And in fact, one of these biological causes is that the size of the anterior hypothalamus is smaller, and the anterior commissure is larger in homosexual men. So what this is telling us is that there is a biological factor to homosexuality, meaning that the brain is different of a homosexual male versus that of a heterosexual male. Okay, gender and sexual orientation. Many studies suggest that homosexuality might be genetic, and the studies that they found are that homosexuality seems to run in families. Not saying that a child who goes a child who's adopted into a two male household. So let's just say a little girl is adopted by two males, okay, and they are homosexual. That does not mean that she will then have a higher chance of being homosexual. No, it's biological families, okay? So the genetic factor, we seem to see a genetic factor to homosexuality. We've seen this in twin studies where homosexuality is more common in identical twins than fraternal twins, meaning that there's a genetic component. However, there are mixed results with these studies. And then finally, fruit flies. Genetic engineers can actually manipulate female fruit flies to act like males during courtship, and then the opposite as well. So showing that there are some genetics involved in sexual orientation. Okay, so prenatal hormones. So this is a cultural or another biological reason for sexual orientation. So what they have found is that prenatal hormones affect sexual orientation during critical periods of fetal development. What they find is that if there is a high level of testosterone exposure to a fetus, then it results in a female showing homosexual behavior. So female hormone exposure to males or a female fetus results in attraction to males. So what they are showing is that if there are increased levels of these either female hormones or male hormones, then that could potentially cause or lead to homosexuality. right now, this is only correlational, right? We only know that there's a correlation between these two things. We can't say that one causes another. However, we can show that there is a relationship between the two.